This episode of the Patrick Hoffman Show is brought to you by, you ready for it, My Pillow. I cannot believe how much better I'm sleeping. I walked by the My Pillow demo thing at Costco probably 50 times. And then I got to meet the founder CEO, Mike Lindell, and had him on my show talking about what it's like to be a crack addict who becomes this hugely successful CEO. So I'm a proud affiliate of MyPillow.com. Now, they have right now buy one, get one. So if you go to MyPillow.com, put my name, first name, Patrick, as a coupon code, I'm telling you, I'm very picky about pillows. I've got a Tempur-Pedic that cost me, I don't know, 120 bucks, something like that. Now it feels like a brick compared to the pillow that I use. There's also a travel-size pillow, which I use for flights. I find it very hard to fly and sleep at the same time. My pillows solve that problem. So go to mypillow.com and put my name at the checkout. That's Patrick. Here's the number if you want to call. If you've got a pen, I'll say it twice. If you don't, 1-800-794-9652. That's 1-800-794-9652. Promo code Patrick gets you hooked up like a fish. Buy one, get one free. You'll find out everything you need to know there. It's all American made. There's actually no risk, high gain. If you don't like it, send it back. No questions asked. MyPillow.com. My name, Patrick, gets you a buy one, get one absolutely free. Which leads me to the segue to our topic, which is psychiatry. Is psychiatry crazy? Do psychiatrists offer answers or more questions? What's the history of what we call psychiatry? How's it related to psychology? And is there such a thing as a Catholic or Christian faith-based psychiatry? We're going to talk about that with Dr. Kheriaty, who is also the guest on episode number 75 of the show. I'll put that in the show notes at patrickhoffman.media. That show is called Hope When Hope Seems Gone. Dr. Kheriaty, waiting in standby in the wings. In just a moment, we'll be on. Don't miss it. Happy to welcome back Dr. Kheriaty, Associate Professor of Psychiatry and the Director of the Medical Ethics Program at the University of California Irvine School of Medicine. He, along with Father John Syak, is the author of The Catholic Guide to Depression, How the Saints, the Sacraments, and Psychiatry Can Help You Break Its Grip and Find Happiness Again. Now, there is a world-class subtitle. Hey, Aaron, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks, Patrick. It's good to be back with you.
We talked about a couple of things I want to revisit. One of them is the Jungwirth effect and the Papageno effect, but I just wanted to kind of hit the rewind and ask a 10,000 feet above the tarmac question. That is, how did you get into psychiatry? Why did you decide to focus on that as an MD?
Yeah, well, I like to say that I didn't so much choose psychiatry as psychiatry sort of snuck up and tapped me on the shoulder. So I studied philosophy as an undergraduate as well as pre-medical sciences, went off to medical school not knowing what I was going to specialize in and being pretty much open to anything that struck my fancy. And early in my third year, when I started doing clinical clerkships, I did a month of inpatient psychiatry. And that was the first time I had encountered up close and personal severe and persistent and serious mental illness. So seeing patients with schizophrenia in the midst of a full-blown psychotic episode, or seeing patients with bipolar disorder, what used to be called manic depressive illness, in the midst of a manic episode, or someone in sort of the profound depths of a serious depression. And I was struck by the nature of the illnesses that we were treating on psychiatry. I worked with a really very skilled attending physician and resident physician that were terrific mentors for me. And I found that, there's certain things within medicine that are pretty cut and dry. I think of infectious disease, for example. Somebody comes in with a pneumonia and you have them cough up some sputum, you grow it, you culture it out on the petri dish, you see what sort of bug is there under the microscope. And then you pick the appropriate antibiotic regimen to zap this thing. And it's a bit algorithmic, and I don't mean this as a criticism. That requires a certain skill set, and a lot of doctors like practicing medicine that way. But I found that some of the more unique, abstract, complex issues that we were dealing with in psychiatry fascinated me. So I was taken in, first of all, by the patients. That one pneumonia can look a lot like the next pneumonia that comes in if it's caused by the same bacteria. But one case of depression almost never looks exactly like the next case of depression. So in psychiatry, in a sense, every patient is a new textbook. Every patient has a unique story and a unique set of circumstances that led them to develop, a particular mental illness or encounter the kinds of life difficulties that we treat in psychiatry. And I think there was the other factor that played a big role was a personal encounter with a friend, close friend from high school, who, when I was a first-year medical student, was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And watching him as I went through medical school contend with this illness. He was an all-American kid, straight-A student, track athlete, got a scholarship to the Air Force Academy. He was quite literally and figuratively, he was taking off in life when this illness struck. And he was medically discharged from the military. He struggled to sort of get his footing after that. I saw lots of ups and downs with Matt contending with this devastating diagnosis. And then very sadly, when I was a first-year resident in psychiatry, Matt ended up taking his own life. And so I think watching what this friend of mine was going through in trying to deal with not only the reality of this illness, but also the effects of this illness on his life, I think probably played a role in moving me in the direction of wanting to do psychiatry and trying to help folks that were dealing with mental illness.
Because I love etymology. I was looking up the root of psychology and the kind of semantic tie-in with psychiatry. Psyche or psyche, the word for mind in Greek, but some etymologies will say soul. Is there how would you distinguish a question of the soul, which might come down to what you talked about earlier, that you're interested in philosophy and existential questions about what it means to be a human being and the vicissitudes of life, versus the brain? So there's body, mind, soul. How do you distinguish those from a psychiatric point of view?
So I like the root word of psychiatry, as you said, because it's sometimes translated mind, sometimes soul. So I'm literally a doctor of the soul. Now, some days I have no idea what that means, but I'll take a crack at this question and see what I can do. So the soul, right, in my understanding, is that which makes a living body alive. Right? So the soul is that in us, that aspect of us that animates us, that informs the living body, that is inextricably bound up with the living human body. And so the mind must be some aspect of that, some higher aspect of the soul's functioning. Involves cognition, involves the experience of emotion, which is obviously very closely tied in with the body as well. So I think our modern conception of mind and body, we very often oscillate between a kind of materialism, right, that says that the mind or the soul in scare quotes is nothing but the brain at work.
Like an epiphenomenon.
The epiphenomenon, right, or the foam on the crest of the wave, and the real stuff is what's happening neurobiologically with activity in the brain and in the central nervous system. And the mind is a sort of mirage, in a sense, that's laid over this more or less physical phenomenon. And that view, it seems to me, can't do justice to our lived experience, can't do justice to even the most basic interior experiences, like basic things like perception of a color, much less abstract thinking, art, science, and so forth. So that's one view that I think sometimes informs people's understanding of psychiatry, but does so in a way that's pretty reductionistic. And it can't take account of the kinds of things, can't fully take account of the kinds of things that we have to deal with in psychiatry. So I like to say that you may have a problem with serotonin in your brain, but that doesn't exclude the possibility that you also have a problem with your mother. Okay. So the other way of trying to understand the mind that has been common in the modern era ever since the work of René Descartes and some of the other thinkers, and starting about 500 years ago in the modern period, is a dualistic view where you have the body over here, and you have this sort of disembodied ghost in the machine mind or soul over here, and these things are somehow tenuously connected. We don't know quite how or quite where or how they work together.
Did Descartes postulate, sorry to interrupt because I'm going to forget it, didn't Descartes postulate the pineal gland somewhere, some interface between
that's right.
between matter and spirit?
The pineal gland is this deep structure in the brain.
Yeah.
You thought, well, okay, maybe this is where this spiritual soul gets a foothold in the body. But the fact is, this sort of complete separation of the two can't work either. It cannot explain what we've learned from modern science about the deep and intimate connection between the body and the mind, or the body and the soul. And so I think the best explanation, insofar as it is an explanation, is that we have something in us that makes us unique, that makes us the living human organism that we are. And whatever that is, let's call it the soul or the psyche, must be closely bound up with the body on the one hand, but also be able to transcend the limits of the body on the other hand, in order to explain our experience of, let's say, for example, free will, or our ability to think abstractly beyond the sort of constraints that a purely materialistic view of the human person would confine us to.
Would an example of that be the ability to think, to bring to mind the concept of justice as transcending a just man, or redness as opposed to that red apple? Is that what you mean? So a universal?
Exactly. That's right. The concept of beauty, or the very concept of truth, that our mind can be in conformity with reality, not this or that particular truth, like 1 + 1 is 2, but the notion of truth, the notion of justice, the abstract concept of beauty. These are mental phenomena that clearly transcend specific physical instantiations of those things.
So it sounds like you're straddling, you're finding a way to navigate between two extremes. On the one hand, you have materialism that says the body is everything. It's just, biochemical reactions and neurosynapses and neural pathways and the gray stuff we call the brain, as sort of the prime matter of the body. The ultimate form of the body is the brain, and that's all there is. On the other hand, you've got this Platonic idea in which the body is almost worthless, that the true identity is the soul, trapped like ghost-like in this little, maybe birdcage would be a better one, so that when you die, the real self can spring out. And so, is that too much of a caricature?
No, not at all. I think those are the poles that we have to navigate between. I think both of those conceptions are incorrect and inaccurate. And you might think, well, this is pretty abstract philosophizing. And what does this have to do with the practice of psychiatry? What does this have to do with my daily life? But in fact, if you begin to think in one or another of these categories that we've just described, you very quickly get led down a path that leads to a dead end in terms of understanding the human person, in terms of trying to get a grasp on human mental life. Yep. If we're completely sort of physical and nothing more, or material and nothing more, then everything that we think, everything that we feel, everything that we do is going to be rigidly determined by the physical laws of nature. And there goes free will. And there goes, it seems to me, the practice of psychotherapy, right? Trying to connect to the person and marshal internal resources for healing that are there within them. That can only be possible if we understand human beings as certainly bound up in a body that has its own limits, but also to some degree capable of change, capable of growth and development through deliberate practice, through the development of virtues, through efforts to relinquish or give up bad habits and vices and behaviors that are self-destructive, addictions, for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is it fair to describe an addiction as any harmful pleasure that can't be the repeated behavior of a harmful pleasure, whether it's porn or cocaine or alcohol?
Sure, I think that's a broad but fair definition of addiction. Under that definition, all of us have them. They may be sort of minor, minor vices as compared to a heroin addict who's shooting up every day on the streets and whose entire life has been literally taken over by this more severe form of an addiction. Mm-hmm. But you could think about addiction certainly existing on a spectrum, and the people who end up with these more severe forms of addiction probably got there in part due to a lot of different factors, but one of them would be the lack of ever developing the virtue of temperance in little things, right? Mm-hmm. Saying no to themselves in little ways that can sort of build that muscle and build up that ability to redirect or to channel our appetites or our inclinations in ways that promote health and human flourishing, mm-hmm. rather than just giving in or acting out on every whim or every impulse. If you begin living like that, and you continue living like that without correcting course or redirecting things, I think sooner or later you are probably going to end up going down the path of these more severe, let's say, clinical forms of addiction, where your freedom and your ability to stay in the driver's seat of your life and steer the course of your life is going to be severely impaired, where this thing will literally take over and you will become enslaved either to a particular substance like alcohol or drugs, or to a particular kind of behavior like gambling or sex.
Gotcha. In my conversations with Jordan B. Peterson, I've been thinking and reading more Carl Jung. And Carl Jung is one of these figures that is misquoted a lot. And I'll give you what's probably a misquote of Carl Jung. And I might even botch this, but it's something like, if all my patients were Catholic and they went to confession regularly, 95% of my practice would be destroyed. Something like that, which is a long-winded way of asking, but the clinical, well, I want to ask two questions. The clinical benefits of disclosing what you've done in the context of sacramental confession, why that's good from a psychological point of view, and also how the incarnation reconciles those apparent opposite poles of matter and body and spirit and soul, and how because going to the title of your book, The Catholic Guide to Depression, seems that the incarnation of Jesus Christ is that uniting of the two extremes without falling into their errors. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, and I like the quote from Jung. I think there's certainly something to it. But there's a danger, if you don't understand this correctly, of Carl Jung out-poping the Pope and putting too much, perhaps. So the first thing I'll say is that the practice of auricular confession, as it's practiced in Catholic and Orthodox churches, is psychologically healthy. And if we're talking about something like an addiction, for example, these sorts of vices tend to grow when we keep them in a little dark corner of our soul. Mm-hmm. And small problems that have begun to develop in our life can very quickly, and in some sense unnecessarily, snowball into more complicated problems if we are not, first of all, honest with ourselves and then honest with God, and doing that through the mediation of another human being, through the priest in the confessional, who is there in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. If we are not honest with ourselves, which is a precondition for being honest with God, then we begin sort of living according to a particular kind of lie. We fool ourselves. We engage in what psychiatrists and psychologists would call, defense mechanisms. There's something unpleasant in my life. There's something that is not as it should be. or there's something that's harmful and outright sinful, and I'm making excuses for it. I'm rationalizing it. I'm repressing it or ignoring it or pretending that it's not there. And this problem, which probably could have been dealt with if I would have taken it to confession on a routine basis and struggled against it, now, over time has begun to snowball. And if I go far enough down that road, the thing may grow to such unwieldy proportions that what could have been dealt with rather simply 2 or 3 years ago is now something that's going to require a lot of professional help and assistance, and it's going to be much more difficult to get a handle on. So I think that's one of the ways in which confession can be helpful, unburdening ourselves and dealing with the spiritual reality of guilt and atonement and forgiveness is also, I think, very important psychologically. And this is where I may not go all the way with Carl Jung, and indeed St. John Paul II wouldn't either, because I quote him in the book as saying that the priest is not a psychologist or psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist is not a confessor. And even Sigmund Freud recognized this when he said, it would be absurd for me to say to a patient, I forgive you your sins. That psychiatry has no power to do that. So on the natural level, there is something healing and helpful psychologically about confession. And I think people who've gone to confession have experienced that walking away and feeling a sense of relief, a sense of interior peace, a lightening of the load, perhaps, that I've been carrying, and all that is to the good. But even more important, I've been reconciled to God. I've been reconciled to the community of the church, and that supernatural element of confession, which cannot necessarily be captured by psychological tests, is a central reality. At the same time, John Paul II was clear that certain sorts of problems lie outside of the scope of expertise of even the best priest confessor. And so recognizing the limits of confession, and the priest recognizing that my role here is to offer the forgiveness that Christ brought us, and that's mediated through the church, and not to play amateur psychologist. That is important as well. To know when it's appropriate to refer someone for professional help is going to be appropriate. In fact, I think a lot of Catholics have the experience of going to confession, and the priest, perhaps with good intentions, but in a way that sort of misses the mark, trying to play amateur psychologist and dig down and do a lot of back and forth in trying to help us fix some sort of psychological problem with which they have little expertise. So staying in your lane and knowing that I'm here to absolve you, right, and to advise you spiritually. But if you're dealing with something like obsessive compulsive disorder, if you're dealing with something like a clinically significant level of anxiety that is getting in the way of your daily functioning, in addition to continuing to go to confession, it may be important for you also to seek out some professional help for a problem like that.
Aaron, I just interviewed a guy called John Gravino, and John puts two streams together to explain where we are as a church of confusion now. And one stream is dissent in moral theological areas, and the other is the introduction of Rogerian non-judgmental positive regard psychology, typified by Carl Rogers and his erstwhile partner, William Colson. And Colson repented of his involvement after the destruction of the Immaculate Hearts of Mary order in Los Angeles, and spent the rest of his life speaking out against materialist, secularist psychology. And I find, just as this is one of my pet peeves, and people who are regular listeners are nodding their heads, it really, I find it irksome when on, let's say, Saturday, and you go to confession, and you're really there for two reasons: to confess your sins and to receive absolution. And confession is kind of turned into a counseling session where the priest and the penitent throw flowers at each other, and they talk endlessly about the backstory in chapter 5 and what my wife did, and I was dropped from my bassinet as a kid, and so on. So there's a kind of an incursion of the therapeutic into the sacramental, and maybe vice versa. Do you see the importance of making those roles distinct, more or distincter, to coin a phrase?
I think that's right, and I think the roles are distinct but complementary. And for people that are dealing with a mental health issue, I like to recommend a both and approach. I mean, ideally, you would have a priest confessor that is helping you in that particular pastoral role, advising you on your spiritual life, spiritual growth, prayer, sacraments, and so forth. And you would have a psychiatrist or a psychologist who is engaged in good evidence-based psychotherapy and not pretending to be a spiritual director. And with the permission of the patient, those two people can talk to one another and provide really good complementary care. And so that would be an ideal situation. Very often, I think, those two things are not available for a lot of folks, or for various reasons that we can get into later in the show. Many Catholics or other Christians may be wary, and for reasons that are understandable, wary of seeking mental health treatment from people who have a worldview that is entirely opposed to their own. Because I think these things do operate in distinct domains, but at the same time, it's a mistake to think that psychotherapy is a value-neutral enterprise. This is one of the mistakes that I think Carl Rogers made. Every psychotherapeutic approach is at least implicitly, whether the therapist knows this or not, is at least implicitly informed by a particular view of the human person. Who is man? What is his nature? What is his destiny? So someone with a purely materialistic philosophy of the human person is probably, whether they realize it or not, is probably going to have some of those assumptions informing their particular approach to treating someone with mental illness, right? It's all about sort of tinkering with the neurochemistry in your brain. I become a kind of engineer of the synapse. In every problem must have a solution that comes in the form of a pill, for example. I think that would be one mistake that psychiatrists could make, ignoring the role that psychological, that cultural and social, that relational, and that spiritual factors may play in terms of someone's depression or their anxiety or even a more serious illness.
Which is a great segue to my next question about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, post-World War II phenomenon. It's been called the Bible of Psychiatry. I understand there have been 5 main revisions. We're now on DSM-5. Now, as I understand it, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is a lexicon or a list of behaviors, and if your patient falls within a certain minimum of these behaviors, then they can be diagnosed as having X mental illness. Is that a blunt-edged caricature? Is that DSM 101?
Not at all. No, that's in fact how the DSM would describe itself. The DSM provides what we call operational definitions of various mental illnesses, meaning that it defines them purely symptomatically. It claims to be neutral as regards to the origins, what doctors call the etiology, right? The underlying causes of these illnesses are something that the DSM more or less stays away from. And so the critiques of the DSM are legion, and many of them are perfectly valid. I think it's important for psychiatrists and for the general public to understand the limits of this particular diagnostic and classification scheme, which was originally developed not for clinical purposes, but for research purposes. So we were having trouble getting good research on mental illness because one researcher would define depression in one particular way, and another researcher would define it according to other criteria. And so when we're trying to compare two studies on depression, it wasn't clear that we were even studying the same kind of cohort or the same kind of population, which made it hard for psychiatry to make progress.
To standardize the whole industry, so to speak.
The DSM was originally for researchers, so that, okay, maybe we haven't nailed down the exact right definition of depression, and maybe what we call depression is actually 4 or 5 different kinds of things. But at least we have a starting point. We have an operational definition, so that when we publish research, we know that we're looking at more or less the same kind of patient population. Mm-hmm. But it moved from that into, well, psychiatrists need a diagnostic and classification scheme for purposes of billing insurance companies, right? And then the things in the DSM started to become sort of reified, right? Meaning that the constructs or the constellation of symptoms that we call depression or OCD was assumed to carve nature at its joints, was assumed to be describing something real. And those categories kind of took on a life of their own. And I think in some cases, those categories have played out in such a way that they describe valid illnesses. Okay, it's clear that there is something out there called schizophrenia. It is clear that there's something out there called bipolar disorder or manic depression that has particular manifestations. And so for things like that, the DSM can be a useful shorthand to be able to sort of spot these things and know it when you see it. But there's many other categories in the DSM where it's not at all clear that the thing being described should be pathologized. It's not at all clear that we're carving nature at its joints. It's not clear that we're describing one thing rather than a collection of things. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to be cautious with whatever the current iteration is of the list of things that count as a mental disorder or a psychiatric disorder, and what they're actually describing out there or in here.
When you say reify, I was thinking that nowadays we say, "Oh, is that a thing?" Right? It's now a thing. Well, so reify literally means to make a thing out of it.
That's right. That's right.
We might bring up the political pressures that can be brought to bear on descriptions too. I'm thinking of the famous or infamous 1973 APA decision to remove homosexuality as a mental disorder. This is described chapter and verse in Robert Rowley's book, Making Gay Okay. This is not the neutral findings of fact or evidence-based decision. This was political pressuring on the APA. So there's all kinds of whenever fallen human beings get involved, there's going to be some warping and twisting of something that otherwise could be at least a helpful tool, if not an infallible source.
For sure, without a doubt. And keep in mind that the DSM is published by the American Psychiatric Association, and it makes an enormous amount of money for the American Psychiatric Association. So there are financial incentives for the APA to continue, first of all, coming out with new editions of this classification manual, and avoiding perhaps drilling down and sorting through some of the harder questions about what actually are the things described in the DSM. Is this particular disorder a brain disorder? Is it a particular response to an environment that someone may have because of their temperament or their personality? Is it a vice? Is it simply sort of a bad habit that's become deeply ingrained? These are sort of different forms of things, and applying a medical model, the broken part in the brain, to each and every construct in the DSM is probably a big mistake. It's to thingify something that's not a thing. And you're absolutely correct that medical associations are subject not only to certain financial interests, not only to certain self-serving interests, of its own members, in this case, psychiatrists, but also to the vagaries of various political pressures and social movements. I recently wrote about this in the New Atlantis in relation to what medical associations are doing in regards to positions on physician-assisted suicide. And some of the political maneuvering and backdoor dealing that goes on there is rather disedifying when you scratch beneath the surface and realize exactly how some of these things are decided. And, you know, the kind of political maneuvering that you described with the APA back in 1973 still goes on very much today. I mean, these organizations, and I would say the APA is certainly guilty of this, seem rather prone to be easily co-opted for political or social purposes that are extrinsic to psychiatry. I recently was speaking to a young psychiatrist, very talented young psychiatrist, who was invited to an APA leadership meeting, sort of tapped as a future leader in the profession, getting together with other young psychiatrists, being introduced to what it is that the APA did. And when he came back, he was very disappointed because the focus was entirely on, okay, if this is something that you want to get involved in, leadership within the APA, this is how you need to maneuver and navigate the organization itself. It was all about the internal politicking of the APA. There was no mention of important controversies or issues within psychiatry that the APA should be wrestling with. And even worse than that, I think there was no mention of why do psychiatrists exist in the first place.
How about the suffering patient?
Right? So what's going on with patient care in the United States? How is the APA trying to address the rise of so-called deaths of despair, deaths by drug overdose, by suicide, by alcohol-related illnesses? What are we doing about the epidemic of suicide, especially among young people? Not a word on any of these really pressing social and epidemiological issues in psychiatry that other people, fortunately, are paying attention to. And you think the APA would be at the forefront of this, but instead they're sort of hanging back to see which way the political winds are blowing. And meanwhile, they're navel gazing and entirely, internally focused on the interests of the organization itself and, the particular political maneuvering of the various members of the organization itself. It seems to me that a medical society that's operating in this way is not really serving the purpose for which it was founded.
Overall, Aaron, do you think that the introduction of I'll call it the med movement, throwing a pill at the problem, diagnosing psychiatric conditions through a purely biochemical model, has that been a net gain? Because I'm asking this from a autobiographical point of view. I definitely have moderate to severe ADHD. There's no doubt about it. If you read the DSM, I got official diagnosis. I have tried 5 or 6 different meds, from Vyvanse to Focalin to Adderall, Adderall XR. None of them gave me the Zen, calming, whatever, and they all came with really nasty side effects. And so it was when I learned from Alexander Havard, the real kind of deep knowledge of the 4 classic Greek temperaments, when I learned what a choleric or sanguine with choleric tendencies was, I went, oh my gosh, I felt like he was reading my soul.
That's me.
And also how all of the 4 Greek, I'll put the link, by the way, to the previous episode with Mr. Havard, great guy. That was like a key that unlocked 5 or 6 different doors. And then I was able to see traits that needed buttressing, because some traits are vices and there's selfishness attached. And then all of a sudden, now it's something I can grapple with. I can contend with it, rather than, hey, take pill X and problem Y is going to vanish. So this is I'm getting back to the finish line now. Has the model that strongly prefers medication over talking things through been a net gain for people generally?
There's been an upside, and there's definitely been a downside to it. And historically, the medical model and what's sometimes called the cognitive revolution in psychiatry becoming much more of a brain-based enterprise than it was, say, 50 years ago, was a necessary corrective to a 20th century psychiatry that had been dominated first by psychoanalysis, by Sigmund Freud and his descendants, spinning off theories about how the mind worked and the unconscious, and the role of various drives in producing mental illness and so forth, had spun off in directions that were not very empirically validated. And oftentimes what you had was a certain philosophy of life and a certain materialistic view of the human person masquerading as though it was scientific. Right? And so mid-20th century, the behaviorists came along and said, all this mumbo jumbo about the unconscious and these inner conflicts that the analysts are describing are not scientific. And we're interested in making psychiatry into a legitimate science. And so, well, what's science? It's the ability to observe consistently and experiment consistently with inputs and outputs. So behaviorism swung things probably way too far in the other direction of saying all this inner mental life stuff, we're just going to bracket, we're going to set aside, and we're going to look at conditioning, right? We're going to look at when I put someone in a particular environment, when I put a rat in a cage and I do this to it, it's going to have this effect, and when I do that to it, it's going to have this other effect. And by the way, we can treat human beings more or less like lab rats or like pigeons. Yes, they're more complex, but the basic principles of how they learn and how they think are the same. And so the behaviorists, to their credit, tried to introduce a more rigorous scientific method into the picture, but threw out some of the baby with the bathwater.
Would that, just to interrupt, just to localize it with a person, would that be typified by people like B.F. Skinner or Albert Ellis or John Watson?
Yeah, Skinner would be the paradigmatic example of the American behaviorist, who, his book Beyond Freedom and Dignity sort of says it all.
Yeah.
The soul really did get thrown out with Skinner, whereas at least the analysts were trying to look at the human being's inner life to some degree and come to some understanding of it, even if they were spinning off on rather fantastic theories about how all of that worked. So then in the 1980s, with the advent of neuroimaging, the ability to look at the structure and function of the brain with things like MRI and PET scanning, with advances in genetics, with new tools that we had to study how the brain and how the body work. Psychiatry rolled up its sleeves and said, okay, we're finally hopefully going to be able to get a handle on especially the more severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia. And we're going to find the answer through biology and through biological interventions like medications or perhaps surgery in the future when our methods are more refined. And I think that was a helpful corrective as well to a behaviorist approach that had very limited tools in terms of understanding human psychology. But again, this purely biological approach trapped us, in a sense, and confined us to methods that could only operate on the level of neurons and synapses and chemicals in the brain.
Purely materialist considerations.
It was another iteration, a more sophisticated one, of a materialist. Well, I should say the methods themselves were perfectly legitimate, but a philosophy that often went with those methods was that this is not just one helpful way to understand what's going on with human mental life, but this is the only helpful way. So science became scientism, again, overly reductionistic. And what psychiatry needs now is a corrective to that, to understand that, okay, we have to look at these illnesses and we have to look at these problems, certainly through a biological lens, but also through the lens of as you mentioned earlier, of temperament, right? That all of us have traits that exist on a spectrum, on a scale. And some of those traits are built in. Those are the temperamental traits. Some of them are acquired. Those are the character traits.
Yeah.
And this shapes how we respond to the world and how we function in the world. And every trait can be an asset and a liability. In some circumstances, it's an asset. In other circumstances, it's a liability. So we have to understand what the person has in terms of maybe there is, maybe the hardwiring in the brain is off kilter, right? And it does require a medication solution. But maybe this is simply who the person is. And we have to understand this in terms of assets in some circumstances and liabilities in other circumstances.
It's so much of what you're sharing, Aaron, is the story of pendulum swings and navigating away from the extremes and trying to continually find a balance that that defeats the current or the momentum toward one set of errors and then another set of errors. Because nowadays, who's in the news now but the world's most famous autistic, mutism, OCD, depressed girl, Greta Thunberg, and who says that her mental conditions are a superpower. Nowadays, there's a tremendous taboo against even describing something in something that might bear the whiff of negative or less than perfect, which is, I think, an indication of another pendulum swing. Maybe
I think
wrong.
that's right. So this concept of neurodiversity, people with a mental illness or a deficiency or a disorder are not actually deficient or disordered. They're just different. I think there is something to that. Okay, so I think people with autism bring certain strengths into the world and a certain way of perceiving things that can give us a different perspective on things. Mm-hmm. But we can acknowledge that without saying that, therefore, autism is not a disorder. No, there are functional deficits. There are things about this condition that make life difficult in any environment and under any circumstances. And this is something for which, on a medical model, we should be searching for ways to help these people, for ways to prevent the condition from happening in the first place. So yes to the notion of neurodiversity, so long as it's placed in a broader context that still allows for the possibility of there being disorder and dysfunction and mental illness, which is a reality, right? It's not helping anyone to claim that people with schizophrenia are not mentally ill.
Yeah, they're purely blessed by it.
They're just exactly. Well, anyone who says that has not lived with or tried to care for a family member that has schizophrenia and seen the kind of suffering and the kind of anguish that it can cause the person afflicted by it and the people, the family and friends who are trying to help that person.
In an upcoming interview, I'm going to be talking with Gil Bailey, who's pound for pound, maybe the top René Girard scholar. And he talks about mimetic desire and people not wanting things so much as wanting what other people want, which leads me to the contagious nature of things like suicide with the Werther effect. We talked about that in episode 79, I think. I'm going to put the previous link in the show notes at patrickhoffman.media. And on the other hand, the Papageno effect. This is a really powerful phenomenon, especially in a media ecology where if something happens in outer Bessarabia, you and I can read about it 5 minutes later on the internet. And so when someone's high profile, whether it's Anthony Bourdain or one of the increasingly long list of entertainers that kill themselves, that can affect people on the edge who learn about it and they finally give in to the despair as well. The Werther effect. Just maybe revisit those the polar opposites in terms of imitating other people's decisions on a bigger scale.
Yeah, so this is a great question because it segues perfectly into the third perspective that psychiatrists need to take into account. So we're talking about diseases, what people have, dimensions of personality and intelligence, what people are, who people are. But we also have to recognize that some people come seeking help from psychiatrists because of what they do, right? Because we are goal-oriented and we do things for a reason, right? And this is the sort of behavioral perspective that informs our understanding of things like addictions and eating disorders, and as you just mentioned, suicide. There's all kinds of factors that may lead a person to get to the point in their life where they realize, or they come to mistakenly believe, I can't go on anymore, or my life has no purpose, or it's not worth it, or I'm in too much pain, and this is the only way that I can escape. And we're influenced certainly by underlying biological factors. There are certain temperaments and certain temperamental traits that can elevate a person's risk for suicide. Temperaments that tend to be more impulsive, temperaments that tend to be more aggressive, for example, can elevate your risk for suicide. There's certainly mental illnesses and disorders, everything from Huntington's disease to schizophrenia to more severe and profound forms of depression and bipolar, that very significantly elevate your risk of suicide. But at the end of the day, suicide is something the person does. It's a behavior. And one of the things that influences our behaviors, as you mentioned, which Gerard drills down on so profoundly, is the effect of other people's behaviors. So we imitate other people's behaviors. We also imitate other people's desires. And the Werther effect is a term that's used to describe the ways in which suicide can have a social contagion aspect to it. So it's well known now, and it's been studied by epidemiologists and social scientists, that if a high-profile suicide occurs, Robin Williams, Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade, especially if it's publicized in a way that tends to romanticize it, that describes the particular means or methods that were used, or that presents suicide or frames the suicide as a potential solution to life's problems, that can produce copycat cases. And in fact, we've had a couple of studies now in recent months looking back at what happened after the death of Robin Williams. And we have some evidence now that the Werther effect occurred after Robin Williams' death and after the ways in which it was publicized, that caused a bump in suicides.
Yeah, for people who don't remember, when Robin Williams committed suicide, the Disney company put a meme on social media, and it was did he play the genie in Aladdin?
He did.
Okay, so he did the voiceover, and it said, "Be free now, genie," something like that. Well, that's practically an invitation for others who are similarly afflicted to be free. Then I mean, we can go. We could do a whole show on this. 13 Reasons Why, the Netflix soft ad for the glory of suicide. But I wanted to ask about the origin. The Surahs of Jungwirth was a novel by Goethe, right? In Germany. That's the eponymous name of it.
18th century novel, and about a protagonist whose romantic pursuits are thwarted, and he ends up in the end taking his own life using a pistol. And after the publication of this, wildly popular both in Germany and Italy, authorities noticed a rash of young men taking their own life, very often using the same means, and in some cases with the book literally tucked under their arm. And that was, of course, anecdotal, not studied rigorously. But since then, in the last 100 years, this phenomenon of social contagion after a publicized case of suicide, in that case it was fictional. In the case of 13 Reasons Why, it was fictional. In the case of Robin Williams, it obviously was not. But in all of these cases, we have evidence of copycat cases that are not just people that would have taken their own lives anyway, and they happen to use a shotgun because that's what Kurt Cobain did. But you can see a bump in regional suicides overall. So you can see an effect on overall epidemiological trends. The suicide rate in the United States as a whole goes up in the months following these deaths. And this has been so well studied and well replicated that the CDC and the World Health Organization have published guidelines on how to and how not to report on cases of suicide in order to try to minimize the Werther effect and the social contagion aspect. I've got a piece at First Things called Killer Show that basically is a critique of 13 Reasons Why, that goes through the CDC criteria one by one and shows how this television show, particularly season 1, systematically violates each of these responsible reporting guidelines. The meme that you mentioned from Disney about Robin Williams' death is a really awful example of not following responsible journalistic guidelines. And that would be the kind of thing that could, unfortunately, contribute to the Werther effect.
Then there's the other pole, the Papageno effect from the character in the Magic Flute. That's maybe we should focus more on that, since it's kind of the doppelganger. Sure. What's the Papageno effect, and how do we know that it's a thing?
Right. So the name comes from Mozart's opera, and it has to do with a person who's considering suicide, and he's visited in sort of Charles Dickens fashion by these childhood spirits who encourage him to take a different perspective on things and to find hope. And when stories like this are published, stories that people who are struggling can't identify with, this person has my same disease, or this person is dealing with the same mental illness that I am, and they got to a very dark place where they considered suicide. And here's an account of how they found their way out of that. Here's an account of how they recovered from that episode of depression. That those sorts of publicized stories have a good effect, have the opposite to the Werther effect in terms of lowering the risk of suicide for populations that may be at risk. So I think it's important for us to highlight these kinds of stories and to communicate to people that may be struggling or may be considering suicide, that there is hope for you. There is always hope for you. This was a topic of one of our previous conversations, and I think it's important for high-profile celebrity suicides probably get a lot of clicks on social media. But what about inspiring stories of people who have struggled through a really rough patch and found the light again? Those things need to be highlighted and emphasized as well as part of our effort to try to begin to address this national suicide epidemic that we're seeing.
Someone could start a whole media platform devoted to, you could call it the Papageno Effect.com, devoted to finding stories of the bus that didn't crash. Because the media machine it sells us the product of fear. And so if you learn that someone has killed themselves, that's a fear-based story. It's considered journalistically sexy. But if someone has overcome something in silence and they've suffered terribly and they've been through this awful trench and didn't give up and did kind of push through to a higher place, Scott Hahn once called it in grace, all bounces or all falls are upward. Those kinds of stories can be a really profound elixir for someone suffering and feels like they're suffering absolutely alone and unique. No one will understand, and life is not worth living. The problem is finding them, because they don't get interviewed.
That's right.
Only their families know their successes.
Yeah. And there are a few young people that have survived suicide attempts. Kevin Hines is one who comes to mind, one of the very few people who survived the jump from the Golden Gate Bridge. He dedicates himself now to suicide prevention efforts and to try to highlight stories like this. But we certainly need a lot more of that.
Luke Maxwell is another one.
Luke Maxwell, terrific. He's
San Diego. You know what? I'm going to go to the show notes, dear listener and viewer, patrickgalvin.media. I will put the link to my conversation with Luke, 16-year-old kid. I mean, it's a terribly amazing story. Got in a van and tried to cross lanes and successfully had a head-on collision. Thanks be to God, no one died. But that was his wake up. He was diagnosed on the spot with profound depression, and now he runs a website called You Can't Be Erased. That's a really, really great example. There's a TED Talk I'll try to find as well, Aaron. It's about I want to say he's a sheriff who for 17 years was stationed at the Golden Gate Bridge and became skilled at talking people off the ledge. And when he would speak with the people who survived their own attempt, 100% of them instantly regretted it as soon as they left the deck.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, the suicidal mind tends to be ambivalent. Part of them, it's not even necessarily that people want to die. They just want to escape a a situation that they perceive is intolerable. I'm suffering, and I don't think there's any other way out, and this is my escape hatch.
Mm-hmm.
So the person in that state needs to be offered hope. People can endure a tremendous amount if they think there could be a light at the end of this tunnel. The most predictive factor long-term for suicide risk is not what mental illness a person has or how much pain they're in or the severity of their symptoms. It's whether or not they believe their situation is hopeless. And hope is not something that can be delivered by prescription. Right? It doesn't come in a pill bottle. And this is one of the areas in which the church's efforts can have a very important and very, very profound impact on the lives of individuals who may be struggling with the temptation to end their life.
Last question. This could be a 9-hour session easily. I don't remember the source of the quote. It might be Nietzsche. It goes, "He who has a why can endure almost any how." Is that Viktor Frankl maybe?
Yeah, that's Frankl ripping off Nietzsche there.
Oh, okay. So I got the goods and the thief
on both counts. Yeah, that's right.
Frankl,
the author of Man's Search for Meaning, a man who survived a Nazi concentration camp, and his experience there later went on to inform his work as a psychiatrist and the central importance of helping people find meaning and purpose in order to endure difficult situations.
Reminds me a little bit of another psychiatrist who survived, in this case, Buchenwald, Conrad Bars, MD. I've interviewed Suzanne Bars, his daughter. Are you familiar with Bars at all?
Yeah, I am. I've read some of his work. I met Suzanne on one occasion at a conference.
Okay, yeah. He's coming from a more Catholic anthropology, obviously, than Frankl. There's a rumor that Frankl became a Catholic on his deathbed. His second wife, Barbara, was a serious Catholic. Frankl. But the question of why, and I love the tagline. That would be a good T-shirt idea. Hope cannot be just found in a pill bottle. How does the incarnation and the example of Jesus Christ, especially starting in the Garden of Gethsemane, ending with his torture and death on the cross, how can that apparent, from a surface point of view, failure be someone's ongoing victory? How does the incarnation and the suffering of Christ provide a source of hope?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that it is the clearest possible revelation to us that God is not indifferent to suffering. Why he permits it in any given case, why the why me question, is still a mystery, and only on the other side of only in eternity, only on the other side of the veil, will we, I think, see the whole tapestry and the ways in which these apparent tragedies or failures were part of God's providential plan. But what the incarnation and the cross do reveal to us and communicate to us clearly is that this is a God who's very close to us in our suffering and in our pain, and all of the not just physical anguish that we might have to contend with in life, but the emotional pain and the emotional anguish as well is something that Christ took on and that he experienced. You see his anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane, not because at that point, not because he's being physically tortured, but because of his interior anguish and contending with what is going to happen to him, contending with the sin of the world that is being laid upon his shoulders in his passion and death. So that's the first thing that I'll say. In a sense, all religions, at least any of them that have any staying power, are some kind of attempt to address the question of suffering. And I think that Christianity's answer, or Christianity's proposal in this regard, is the most profound and the most satisfying. I have great respect for Buddhists and for Buddhist philosophy and Buddhism, not California Buddhists, but real Buddhists, my Tibetan friends. And Buddhism is an attempt to answer the question of suffering, the problem of evil. And it's one that has some degree of compelling force, but ultimately what Buddhism says is that we suffer because we're too attached to things, and suffering is a kind of illusion that we need to free ourselves from. And while that is a powerful attempt to answer this question, ultimately it's one that I don't find particularly satisfying, because my chronic pain does not feel to me like an illusion. It feels pretty real.
Freaking hurts, dude.
Yeah, freaking hurts, dude. Like, do you want to know if it's real? Well, try kicking this rock. So, whereas recognizing that our God is a God who became incarnate and suffered on the cross for me, and that suffering, if born out of love, can be redemptive, that is a notion that doesn't make my pain go away, but can help me day to day to bear it up.
Yeah.
Again, there are other philosophies that try to contend with suffering. I mean, think of Stoicism. Stoicism is a powerful answer to suffering, but it's one that I'm certainly not capable. I'm certainly not capable of. Just trying to wrestle with this on my own without help from the outside, without God's grace, would be, I think, humanly impossible. And so, for Christians who try to enter very deeply into the mystery of our Lord's passion and death, it doesn't make these difficulties go away. It doesn't give us clean and clear answers to, why did God give me this illness, or why is God allowing my loved one to suffer from this mental illness? Mm-hmm. But it can be the thing that helps us to take that suffering and unite it to something higher, and to bear it up with God's grace in ways that not only make it tolerable, but can also help us grow in faith, in hope, in love and compassion for other people. And that's not easy to do. I don't claim in my own case that I've made much progress in that area, but certainly we can see in the lives of the saints the way in which this plays out. Each and every one of the saints suffered a lot at various points in their life, and some of them, it seems, for the better part of their entire existence, and yet how powerfully they were able to love, I think, not in spite of their suffering, but even in and through their suffering. Mm-hmm. That's the mystery of the cross, and that's what Christianity has to propose to us.
Would it be fair to summarize it by saying that the traditional 3-word formula, offer it up, does not mean take it away?
That's right. You can only offer something that is yours, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, that pain is yours. And it's something that, to one degree or another, no one else is going to be able to completely understand. But God knows, because he has entered into it. And he is close to you, not only because he created you, but also because he suffered with and for you. God is more inward to me than I am to myself, as St. Augustine put it. And that I think is a very consoling thought.
Good place to put an ellipses, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty. Thanks a lot for your time. I know you're busy and you've got a full slate of students and patients. So I thanks for carving out time. Love to continue the conversation. Maybe a live setting. What do you think?
That'd be fun, Patrick. Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed the conversation.
All right, me as well. Go to patrickcoffin.media. I'll put links to Dr. Kheriaty's essays in First Things and elsewhere, also the New Atlantis, and maybe I'll include my Buddhist joke. How's that for a cliffhanger? Thanks again. God bless, Aaron. Godspeed.
Thanks, Patrick.
This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.